that you already own it called the Cloud Office Hours. So for this month, I'm super excited. We're going to be talking about modern data estate with Miguel Wood and Mark Quickel. So let's get the show on the road. Why don't you go ahead and advance, Miguel? So welcome everybody. You already own a team. It's myself, Bob Ballard, Principal Cloud Strategist here at Planet Technologies, along with Nia Giles, George Scott, Ken Nubler, Scott Dowling. We have Mary Tucker, who keeps all of us in line to make sure we keep all our promises to you, as well as the guidance of our fearless Vice President, Steve Winter. So don't forget, as you already own it customers, you're able to email the team at any time at youalreadyownit@go-planet.com. To reach out to the team to help get answers to questions. What should I be thinking about on this? Can I talk to somebody about these topics, etc. We promise to get back to you at least with we're looking into it within 24 hours on that, and then hopefully an answer in less time shortly thereafter. So feel free to take advantage of that. Go ahead, Miguel. So with that, I'm going to, we've got a great agenda. I'm going to turn it over to Miguel to get things kicked off in just a second. We're going to talk about, what is data estate, talk a little bit about data modernization, break into globally distributed data, and then cloud scale analytics with Mark Quickel as well, and then open Q&A for folks there. So why don't you take it away, Miguel?
Well, thank you, Bob. So first of all, it's an honor to basically to be able to talk to you about this today. It's a very important topic, I believe, and I think anyone that understands where we are going and what we've seen going on in the IT space understands what this is. My name is Miguel Wood. I'm an enterprise solutions architect here at Planet Technologies. And I've also got Mark Quickel, who will also be assisting and basically taking over for the analytics portion of and he's a technical practice manager, but I'll make sure he introduces himself as well when we get there. So what is the modern data state? And this is really kind of one of the things that it's a term that's been around for just a couple of years. It is now more of an industry standard term. We first saw it in a blog post about 2.5 years ago from Microsoft. And it is basically all of your data and everything around your data within your organization. It is, a lot of people think when we're actually modernizing data and we're talking about that, where everything's moving to the cloud. I will tell you that is definitely not the case. What we're definitely seeing now is the majority of clients and the majority of what the need is for data is that it's definitely in a hybrid state, meaning that we have data that will reside and probably will reside on premises for the foreseeable future, as well as data that will take advantage of cloud optimization, whether that be from a cost perspective or the technologies that are there and available to us in that. Now, with all the data that's coming in and growing so quickly, one of the challenges we have is not only storing it, but also using it for our organization's benefit, whatever that may be. We have data coming in nowadays from IoT, from devices. We have data coming in from applications, from mobile places. We have data coming in everywhere. And a lot of people still have that mindset that, oh, we're simply talking about the standard OLTP databases, whether that be SQL Server, whether that be Oracle, and so forth. And then even moving into OLAP, which is when we start talking about data warehouses and these large lakes of data, whether they be on premises or otherwise. Well, all of this data and being able to utilize this data is critical in making sure that we have it organized first, making sure it's optimized, and then being able to make decisions off that data. So analyzing it, storing it, that's actually fairly straightforward and easy. I say that, yes, we have a whole bunch more options, and yes, we need to be considered with that exponential growth of data that I think everyone here is aware of. And then, of course, how do we use that? Do we actually use tools such as artificial intelligence or machine learning to go ahead and drill into that data and then expose it using business intelligence to make the decisions that we need to for organization, be proactive? So when we're talking about optimizing the data state, and especially the hybrid data state, we need to make sure that we understand the four, basically kind of the four pieces of what we can actually do when we're optimizing that data state. Now, even though it says hybrid, I will tell you that, yes, you'll see that the very first piece is a data modernization on premises. And although we will be focused primarily on the Microsoft technologies, I do not want to limit that to Microsoft technologies. As you'll see when we discuss this later on, is we will be able to discuss whether that be Oracle, whether that be non-relational databases such as NoSQL, and many other industry standard data storage mechanisms that we could utilize. But in the Microsoft realm, or the Microsoft ecosystem, when we talk about modernization of the data on premises, I think one of the things that everyone's going to understand is that we're talking about SQL Server. And I will spend a little bit of time on this because this is where the majority of our clients are. They're dealing with the standard SQL servers. They may have multiple SQL servers. I do want to mention, and I will get into some examples that we do, that I've run across here, even at Planet with our clients, in some of the pieces that we've done for optimizing or modernizing their data estate. I will get to that shortly after we talk about this optimization process. So when we talk about the data modernization on premises, and we're talking about SQL Server, we're primarily talking about making sure that we have up to the most current version, or at least a current version of SQL Server. I will tell you, I still, even today, run across clients that are running 2005 and yes, even 2000, SQL Server 2000, which of course are out of support. And they are at risk, of course, and if anyone has been around any type of situation where you lose your data, you know that that's probably a career-changing move for most of your DBAs or those people responsible for that data. So it is very important to ensure that we are staying on top of that. Now, that's one thing that we actually ensure that we're actually on the most current bits from a safety perspective, security perspective, but it is incredibly important from a optimization of being able to utilize it. You will see one of the things that I think we've run across significantly in the last 3 or 4 years is we've run across clients that have 15, 16 SQL servers spread out across their environment on premises, and we have literally taken and actually consolidated those databases into one or more or very few SQL servers, whether they be on premises and or in the cloud. Most of them across the last 3 years have been a combination of both, and that's important. We will talk about the data modernization to Azure, and of course that takes us into the SQL database side of Azure SQL database. And I want to make sure that everyone understands that we have multiple flavors there. Although Microsoft, and they're notorious, even with Ignite this week, we've seen them rename several different platforms, and they continue to do that. The original SQL database that we found in Azure was basically a singleton and or an elastic pool, which is basically a shared resources across those singletons. One of the challenges there, of course, is that we had not a lot of control over those database engines. Again, I'm specifically talking the database engines. Remember, with SQL Server, we have the ability and other services that are there in SQL Server. I will speak to those in a few minutes, specifically, for instance, SQL Server reporting services, SQL Server analysis services, and even SQL Server integration services that may and probably are still critical to a lot of organizations. When we jump to the data modernization to Azure, in other words, modernization and migration to SQL database, one of the most important SQL databases is the last one that is the most recent, and it's called the managed instance. And why that is so important is it almost allows for us to basically, rather than do a lift and shift of the entire VM with OS and SQL Server bits and then move it and place it as a VM in Azure, we have the ability to take the database engine within a SQL Server database engine installation and move it to a managed instance. The parity of a managed instance in SQL database, Azure SQL database, is almost 100%. And I'll get to some of those things that are very, very important. A lot of people, when they first looked at SQL database 2 years ago, that was not an option. That was, they actually ran into problems, and I'll give you some examples. For instance, whether that was using SQL Server agent jobs or specifically using DB Mail, which is a lot of legacy applications still utilized today. So you do need to understand that when you take a look and actually go out to Azure and take a look at SQL database, you will see all three of those: the singleton, the elastic pool, and finally the managed instance. I will tell you that the majority of our migrations or modernization when we're taking data and moving it to Azure recently have been primarily to managed instance. Very rarely do we go to the SQL database singleton or elastic pool. Well, what about globally distributed data? In that perspective, what we have is Azure Cosmos DB. And this is the NoSQL, and I'm hoping everyone understands that NoSQL is really that non-relational SQL. So we have all this data coming in, but it may not be structured. It's semi-structured or not structured at all. What are we talking about? Possibly flat files, CSVs, JSON, many other pieces of data that are coming in and need to be managed, but also need to be accessible throughout the world instantaneously. That's one of the challenges that we have that can be overcome with a Cosmos DB, and specifically with Azure Cosmos DB. All this data and where it comes in, and I'm only touching just several different pieces here, because when we take a look at the entire data platform in Azure and what Microsoft provides, there is a lot. We'll touch on some of those, such as data lakes and Azure Data Lake and the SQL Data Warehouse, which is now known as Azure Snaps, which Mark will be talking about later on. And of course, how do we analyze that? Now, why do we actually call it cloud scale analytics? The whole thing about cloud scale analytics is using the capabilities and very easily scaling up and scaling out and using some significant hyperscale capabilities to be able to analyze all this data that is wherever it may reside, whether it be on premises as well as in the cloud. And of course, analyzing is only one component. How do we then distribute that or make it available, visualize that to our users to make the decisions they need to make, either reactively and or preferably proactively in our organizations? And that we'll get to as well. So when we take a look at this optimization of the hybrid data state, there's really two pieces here. I break it down very simply into modernization as well as migration. And the migration, obviously, to take care of the allow for the utilization of the cloud power that you have. So data modernization, and again, I'm going to be concentrating on the database engine here. You really have kind of these four pillars when you're looking at the Microsoft stack. Managed instance, as I mentioned when we were talking about the cloud optimization to the of a database or data modernization to the cloud, is where I am able to very easily migrate that almost a one-to-one. Yes, there are going to be certain things, but I will tell you also the other thing that you're doing or able to do at the same time that you're modernizing this data is to clean up some of the data. A lot of the projects that I've seen, we have dealt with databases and or structured data, even some of the programmability within the databases, whether that be Oracle or SQL, where they are able to be updated to utilize and or get rid of some of the deprecated functionality, so that it becomes more performance oriented. There is, of course, a comparison to what you can do with AWS. One of the things that people get really concerned with is, well, goodness, how much is this going to cost? Because you're now moving from a install base where I can kind of sometimes hold on to it for a long time, even though you may go out of support, as I mentioned before, where I have the ability to, I'm actually going to be paying on a monthly basis for my data platform, if you will, my database engine. Keep in mind that you have the ability to not worry about the investment that you've made, specifically that capital expenditure investment that you may have made in software and hardware, when you can actually go ahead and convert that into your Azure cloud. And that's what we call or Microsoft calls the Azure hybrid benefit. Being able to take that licensing that you have in SQL Server and even from your OS perspective and utilize that in Azure. Again, also, yes, you can go by the pay-as-you-go or the month-by-month, but if you do the reserve capacity pricing, in other words, I guarantee that we're going to be using this, that significantly lowers your cost. And of course, again, there is that CapEx versus OpEx. For most organizations and industries, that is a very, very important and very beneficial perspective from a financial thing. Yes, there are some that don't prefer that, such as oil and gas, but in most organizations, you'll find that CapEx to OpEx is a good thing. Well, what happens about the SQL servers or those pieces that may not meet or have specific requirements where I need to have control over the OS or the underlying operating system or the SQL Server engine that I may not have the capabilities to tweak, if you will, when I move them to Azure. We still have the ability to run the SQL Server, the entire SQL Server platform in VMs in Azure as IaaS. Yes, we can run them again on Windows, but we also have the ability to run them on Linux again on the newer versions of SQL Server. What other capabilities do I concern myself with? Again, I've been concentrating on the database engine up to this point, but remember what I mentioned, SQL Server reporting services. There's not a SaaS offering for that. In fact, we'll get into the visualization such as Power BI. But if I've done a significant, or my organization has done a significant investment in SSRS, I may need to go ahead and have an SSRS or even that data placed on a SQL server. What about SSAS or analysis services or integration services packages that I'm using to do my ETL or my extract, transform, and load of my data sources into a data warehouse? That would possibly mean that I would want to go ahead and do a lift and shift of those VMs that are hosting or that are running my SQL Server platform with those other services besides the database engine into Azure. And I will say that you can mix and match that as well. One of my clients on the West Coast literally only put the VMs and the SSRS in their VMs and end up going ahead and moving it to MI or managed instance, all their data. Be aware I can still use the back end for reporting services as a SQL Server managed instance because of that compatibility and near 100% compatibility with a SQL Server database engine. When we talk about SSIS, I want to briefly touch about that. I think we'll touch on that on the analytics when we start talking about the ETL and actually shift to an ELT and extract, load, and then transform later on or analyze later on. We don't have SSIS in the cloud. We have something similar to that, and that's the Azure Data Factory that we'll mention or talk about briefly. Well, what about the other pieces, such as open source software that my organization may have invested in, such as PostgreSQL or MySQL or MariaDB? Those things are still available as platform as a service in the Azure platform as well. And I'm not only listing just a couple there. And that also helps the organization to take their investments, move them up, and take advantage that the platform as a service offers both from a management perspective as well as from a cost perspective. As I mentioned before, hybrid. I rarely run across an organization today that is 100% going to go everything into the cloud as far as their data platform. And so we do need to consider the hybrid functionality. There are going to be some server applications, especially legacy ones, or there's going to be the need for sensitive data that, because of compliance or regulatory compliance, must reside on premises, at least until the regulatory changes have occurred. That is a perfect need. Then you start worrying, well, what about this cloud scale analytics? Can we actually go ahead and take advantage of that? Yes, there are data gateways that we can actually utilize that will allow for us to analyze as well as visualize the data, even though it's residing on premises in the cloud and to our users. So all those capabilities are there, and I would argue that the hybrid is really going to be an important factor, at least for the near-term future for those. When I talk about that database engine, I only put this slide in again to make sure people kind of understood kind of what it looks like in a modernization up to a hybrid cloud. So in the old days, of course, we had our physical servers with SQL Server installed with, of course, the OS running on it. And in those days, probably just Windows. And that's what we kind of think of. And as we move up the pattern into software as a service, our data engine really ends at platform as a service. Our software as a service would be more of your visualization, such as Power BI, that we use for visualizing the analyzed data post analysis, if you will. So we have this ability to, if we look back many years ago and have those physical pieces, we had that initial, especially from DBAs and from IT pros, especially that have been around for a while, that hesitancy to move to virtualized SQL servers. As the technology caught up, the virtualization technology caught up, we were able to go ahead and virtualize it and not have any performance impact or very minimal performance impact for virtualization. Once it became virtualized, then it's really a very simple process to move those virtual servers into an IaaS, or infrastructure as a service VMs, whether they be on Windows machines, whether they be on Linux machines, or otherwise. And this is not just for SQL, this could be for Oracle as well, which Azure does provide for. And then, of course, our Azure SQL database, whether that be the singleton, elastic pool, or managed instance that I've talked about, that is your paths where I don't no longer have to worry about managing, updating, patching, not only the operating system and optimizing the operating system to run and managing that and constantly have to operate that, but also the SQL bits, the SQL Server bits. That is, if you talk to DBAs, that can be a daunting task to ensure that all of that is actually maintained and up to date. So what are we looking at again today? A little less than a year ago, we had SQL 2019, SQL Server 2019 launch back in November of last year. So that, I will tell you, some of the capabilities that you have, besides some of the in-memory so forth, even in 2017 and 2019, you have the machine learning capabilities that are built into that database engine, the lift and shift to the cloud, or easy migration to the cloud. One thing I do want to mention about managed instance is people start saying, oh, well, I'm concerned about my code, my program, my stored procedures, and those things. Keep in mind that the managed instance is running on the latest, if not before, it hits the bits for the SQL Server on-premises or EXE installs for the database engine. So you are able to ensure that you have the highest performance and capabilities within a managed instance for the SQL database. And Bob and Mark, I am not monitoring the comments, so if there's any questions that pop up, please do not hesitate to interrupt and let me know as I've got these monitors up and going. So since I've mentioned and talked about that, and the managed instance seems to be the newest piece for managing or migrating that data, I do want to talk about that migration. So if I have a SQL Server on premises, what are my options here? Do I want to modernize to Azure, or do I want to modernize to on-premises? If I have the need to stay on-prem or on-premises, I can go ahead and upgrade to SQL Server 2017 or 2019, and of course also update the OS. Keep in mind that may actually have impact as well, and be a significant amount of work in that type of modernization path. Modernizing to Azure is similar, and I can go to paths with the Azure SQL Database MI or managed instance. But if I have need of some of those other services that managed instance does not provide, I also have the ability to do the VMs. I want to call out and remind what I mentioned just before briefly, is that you still have the ability to even have a VM that has a SQL Server with the other services, such as SSAS, analysis services, SSRS, reporting services, and or IS, integration services, and then still have the database engine be within the database managed instance. Keep in mind that because they're in Azure, they're still going to be very similar, and you're not going to have the issue that you would have in normally, that you'd actually separate those pieces out. I wanted to call this out, and one of the reasons I left this slide in on this one is managed instance. I said SQL database because the messaging when you go out to the Azure site and you look at the SQL database is that you will see there's 3 different types of SQL database. There is the singleton that I've been mentioning, which has been around for a long time. The elastic pool, which is simply a shared or a compartment of resources that I can have one or more singleton databases share. But then we have the managed instance, which of course is following under the SQL database. It is some of those things that I mentioned. Of course, it's 100%. Now the next slide that I have shows all these things that are not available in singleton and elastic pool, some of which I think most people would say are critical. So I also have my backup and restore that I can control, user controlled. I have from a programmability, I have global temp tables, which I wasn't able to have in a singleton in the standard SQL database. Linked servers. That is something that a lot of organizations still utilize, especially if I'm trying to bring Oracle in as a linked server to my SQL server. CLR, the Common Language Runtime modules. If I've actually done extensibility in the database engine, that's all available here within the MI. DB Mail, as I already mentioned, SQL agent jobs. From a security perspective, your role level security, the SQL audit, data masking dynamically, your encryption is out of the box. So you have TDE already in place, which means you're encrypted at rest as well. So this, and by the way, this is really just touching the spear. But if I actually say that it's 99% compatible, I hope everyone understands that that's really makes it really a big breeze. Now you're going to say, well, what about, how do I find out, am I really going to be compatible to do that? Well, Microsoft has a bunch of tools I'll get to in just 2 slides. So the last piece is, why would I want to do this? Why would I want to modernize my data state? Well, I've already talked about from a management perspective, but when we take a look at both management as well as cost, there are some significant benefits. And there is even a white paper that you can download that Microsoft is obviously has available to you from Forrester Research that gives you some very, very interesting facts of moving from SQL Server to SQL Managed Instance, SQL Database Managed Instance, and what your ROI is. I will tell you, almost every single one of my clients have experienced that ROI very, very quickly. As I mentioned, from a consolidation perspective, if you take 18 database servers, which was a client that I was dealing with before, and you combine that down into 4, imagine just the licensing and hardware savings that you're going to have right off the bat. When you start taking a look at those kind of things, where I'm also now not having to, if I move to managed instance, I'm not having to worry about OS patching, all the software and or effort that it takes to doing all that software patching and managing that software patching, as well as the SQL Server bits. So there's a significant amount. There's some pieces here. I would urge you to take a look at that, but I think that it would, you'll find them that they pay off very quickly. It talks about 6 months or less. I have seen this even less than that in 4 months paying off, especially on a consolidation effort. Why the increase in productivity is because they're not having to deal with a lot of those pieces. As I mentioned, there are tools that are available. Microsoft has a slew of them. Right now, off the top of my head, I can think of 6 of them. But what we have are a couple of very important tools. If you'll look on the lower left-hand side of that slide, I see the SQL Server Migration Assistant and the Data Migration Assistant. Those are, so let me start with the DMA. The Data Migration Assistant is the one that would be utilized to take a look at SQL Server-based assessment. And what it will do is it will go out, take a look at your SQL Server, your database engine, and actually go ahead and analyze it. It will spit out a report and says, and you tell it where you're going to move it to, whether you're moving it to SQL MI or even upgrading it to, say, SQL Server 2019. It is not just for Azure. Although this looks like it's just for Azure, this is also for data modernization on premises. So all of a sudden, I'm able to see all the deprecated code that I see in my stored procedures. It literally goes and scans all that. It tells me those things, that warnings and or any blockers. I will tell you almost every single time, there's a lot of warnings, because if you're dealing with a database that's been around, say, since even 2008 or 2012, there is going to be some T-SQL deprecated commands in your stored procedures. That doesn't mean they're not going to run, but it's just simply making you aware that there may be either that it may go away in the future, or that there may be other options to optimize and increase the performance of those stored procedure and programmability objects. So it's a very good tool. Even if you're not going to be migrating, it's a really good tool to get an idea of what kind of work you have to do to deal with. With the SQL Server Migration Assistant, or the SSMA, there are different flavors for those. And those flavors are based on each of the different possibility of whether I'm looking at Oracle. So there's an Oracle one. There's one for MySQL, as well as many other open source ones, as well as one for even Access. And those are specific to those platforms. It's not wrapped up into one. So the SSMA has a whole bunch of different flavors depending on the source that you're going to, and obviously the cloud that you're going to be doing. As I mentioned, you can do that and move that all over. Those are your assessment tools, the DMA and the SSMA, to understand what the work is going to be for you to go ahead and modernize and optionally migrate up to Azure as well. What we also have is the database migration services, and that is a tool, a PaaS tool that's available to you from Azure that allows for you to do these massive migrations. They can be massive, they can be small. Be aware that even DMS is available offline, but even online within the Azure environment, it is and can be free for up to 4 cores, up to 6 months. And so that's something I definitely want to call out, especially if you're going to be looking at SQL Server to maybe going to DBMI. There is a really good migration guide from on data migration specifically from on-premises to the cloud at datamigration.microsoft.com, and I want to call that out. So what does the process look like if I'm going to do this migration? And these are things that we want to be concerned with moving forward. So the migration process, of course, has a pre-migration phase where we're actually going to go ahead and discover, assess, and convert. Especially the conversion hopefully is going to be minimal, but the assessment is critical, as well as the discovery. One of the things that several years ago, I was brought into a database modernization and consolidation because they hadn't updated and kept current with all of their SQL installs. So they'd had the IT department had basically gone out and installed a whole bunch of SQL servers throughout the organization, and they had not kept up with their licensing. So they were going to get hit with a significant licensing component. And at that time, they're also dealing with, even though it was old, they were going to have to deal with that as well. So one of the things that we had to do was find out where and what all of those SQL Server installs were, and the different flavors from 2000 on. And then, of course, assess what had to be done to either consolidate and or migrate. And we did not migrate all of them, but we did migrate the majority of them to Azure. Then the migration component is, of course, migrating the schema first, moving the data, making sure the data is now in sync, and that may be multiple phases. I'm working with a client today that I know that will actually be moving the source schema up. We'll then be moving the data, and then we'll actually have to sync it once we actually do our final, because of course we're going to be doing testing once it's actually up in the cloud for majority of reasons, whether that be security, whether that be from a functionality perspective. And then prior to the cutover, when we actually do the cutover, and to keep it minimal, so there's minimal business impact, we'll actually do another synchronization of the data as well. Post-migration, it's simply to make sure the applications are working well, testing, and of course, optimizing the platform. So having done a lot of these migrations and literally being kind of on point for Planet in doing the data platform and managing the data platform for our clients, I want to provide what I've found from my experience on moving the data platform, specifically the database engine, to Azure. I will tell you that in my personal experience, the SQL database managed instance is the best solution for migration of existing applications to Azure SQL database, hands down, because I have that ability to basically near parity. I can consolidate them, and I am getting rid of a significant amount of overhead from a management and administration perspective. If I have the necessity for those other services and or really specific operating system settings or SQL Server settings that are down at the very low levels, yes, I would actually then fall back to a SQL Server running on a VM. Now, I do have the option, of course, to run that on Windows and Linux. The only time we really run across Linux with SQL Server now is if they have modern ones and they're actually moving to take their virtual instances and move them up to Azure and run them. Last but not least, SQL Database. Now, I've kind of hit SQL Database, and that's the Singleton Elastic Pool kind of hard because you heard me concentrating on MI, and that's more from a modernization and migration perspective. But SQL Database is still a very good option if I am dealing with a team or development team that is concentrating on cloud-based application development. And it also is very good if I need it to be smaller, if it's not a or application-specific database. That's when you really want to take a look at SQL Database. Yeah, I'll leave that as there. So I'm going to move from the database engine, from the classic OLTP, and move a little bit to the globally available, or the Cosmos DB, which is really your NoSQL. Again, for those that are not familiar with NoSQL, it's been around for a long time. It actually means non-relational SQL, or non-relational database. So it is this Cosmos DB is very, very critical when I want to ensure that I have the data. Again, doesn't have to be SQL. It can be anything other than SQL, but also SQL as well, SQL based, anywhere in the world, and to be able to scale that out very, very well. So if I need to ensure that that data is available anywhere in the world within less than 10 milliseconds, that is actually guaranteed right off the bat. It allows for me to basically, it's schema agnostic. I can use key values, I can use documents, I can use wide columns, even graph data models, and I can store that everywhere. It allows also for native support for other OSS APIs, MongoDB, Cassandra, Gremlin, and even again, like I want to make sure that we mentioned, it still supports SQL as well. So it does allow for that to actually grow and move forward. I would mention that what does that architecture look like without going super technical. And again, I do have, if someone asks questions, I'll be glad to answer those a little bit more in detail. But this is kind of what it looks like from an architecture perspective. So I have a generic globally distributed application using Cosmos DB on the left-hand side. So you'll notice I actually see a browser. Azure Traffic Manager, based on their location, is going to send them to different Azure regions, and those Azure regions will then back end hit the Cosmos DB with both app and session state available. A good example, again, a real world example would be, for instance, a gaming platform that is worldwide, and that's an example there. These two diagrams and this information about them are available in the Azure Enterprise Architecture Library as well. Having said that, I am going to, I will go ahead and mention about the data warehousing, and let Mark kind of take over at this point. Mark?
Yeah, let's jump actually forward to the analytics slides. I think it's like 2 slides ahead, and while he's flipping there, just a quick introduction. I am Mark Quickel. I am the technical practice manager here at Planet for our Azure data team, which covers data analytics and BI. And it's a pleasure to speak with all of you today. I was really impressed with the amount of information, so thank you, Miguel, for sharing all of that. I'm sure it was a lot to digest for everyone. So what I want to do is take about 10 to 15 minutes and just go through a few analytic patterns here using different services available in Azure and chat through that. Unfortunately, with the time that we had today, we won't be able to get into every possible option that's available to you, including some of those IaaS solutions that Miguel was talking about earlier, like reporting services or Azure Analytics as a service as well. But I want to focus on a few key areas and areas that we've seen interest in, and areas that we believe Microsoft is placing focus upon. So Azure Synapse Analytics is currently in Azure as an offering for essentially the replacement for the data warehouse. Now, I say a replacement, really it was a renaming of their data warehousing solution, which is not too atypical from the OLAP solutions that many of you have probably run into either on-prem or if you're using the Azure one today. And there is a new capability that's in preview, which is called the Azure Synapse Analytics Workspaces, which is really what I want to focus on in this slide and the next, which is sort of the analytical piece of Synapse. And there's a screenshot here. This is actually a Microsoft provided graphic, which looks fantastic. I'll go back to the last slide. Thank you. So this is the modern data warehouse solution pattern. And this would be your typical data warehousing, your traditional data warehousing solution for doing analytics. And as you can see here, you have sort of the ingestion happening at the left through some sort of orchestration through Data Factory. The data is stored somewhere, some analysis is done on it, and then visualization is created in Power BI. And there's nothing wrong with that model. In fact, you can use all of the Azure services available to you today, and you can continue to operate in this manner. Thousands of organizations are using Azure Databricks, for example, and Azure Databricks will intertwine and play very, very nicely with Synapse or as a standalone solution directly to Cosmos or whatever storage mechanism that you want to use. Same thing with Power BI. Power BI workspaces exist, and you can connect directly to Azure Data Lake Store Gen 2 if that's what you want to do, and take your data and put it into a nice fancy dashboard. But the model creates complexity. This model creates some complexity because you have to provision and deprovision these multiple services. You have to set up connections between, say, Databricks and Cosmos, more explicitly. It's more steps. It does require a separate monitoring and security posture across all of these different services, and the data becomes more siloed, and it needs to be marshaled into these different data stores. And so the idea of Azure Synapse, and specifically the Synapse Analytics side, is about providing an end-to-end solution. So you have this single unified interface. ETL can be done directly in with hybrid data ingestion. Self-service analytics and reporting is available directly in the same UI, and end-to-end monitoring and security is all managed in one place as well. So Synapse is eliminating that sort of divide between traditional data warehousing and data lakes, as well as reducing the silos between the different roles. So on the analytics side, Synapse is important for a few reasons. As I mentioned, it does eliminate those silos. Like if you're into doing analysis, which is kind of where I personally sit on the fence of things, you can come directly in here and you can write SQL queries, you can write reports and do that type of thing. If you're more on the data engineering side, you're used to writing pipelines and that type of thing. Again, you can come right in here. There's an icon, it's the fourth down on the left, where you can create these orchestration pipelines directly in here. And if you're on the data science side, you can come in here and you can create Spark notebooks, Jupyter notebooks, and write your PySpark or whatever it may be directly in here as well, without having to go anywhere else. Now, keep in mind with Synapse, there are different compute models that you have to take into account. So I mentioned earlier, there's the sort of the traditional data warehouse side, and that certainly exists. That's your provisioned SQL pools. And that is billed by the hour and is designed for sort of large multi-processing scenarios. There are also SQL on-demand pools, and these pools are typically generated dynamically. And they are a much, much lower cost option. And it's something that you're going to want to consider as you're working in Synapse Analytics as to what model works best for you. So a great scenario would be you have data that's living in a data lake somewhere. Maybe you have just a bunch of invoices or a bunch of transactions that are living somewhere, and you want to run some analytics against that data. Well, you can spin up and create a dynamic view using these distributed SQL pools and do so, and you're only charged for the time that the processing happens. And it's charged based on terabyte read. So it's a much cheaper way to do sort of that computational analysis. If you're on the Spark side, you can create provisioned Spark pools, which is a provisioned Spark cluster with a given number of nodes, and that's billed per cluster uptime. And so the way that works is if you're going to use Spark to do analysis against data, you would provision the pool, and then you set a timeout on the pool. Like after 5 minutes, it would go down, or after 15 minutes, it would go down. And that would be something you'd want to monitor along the way to see like how much it's getting hit. And so you would execute your job, it would spin up the pool as it needs to, execute the code, and then after that timeout period, it would spin back down again, and you're charged essentially for that uptime. Because Synapse is tightly coupled with Azure Data Lake Gen 2 technology, you can extend your analytics to the data lake from your data warehouse without having to copy or move the code. And we're not going to do a demo today, but it's really pretty powerful to come in here, see a data set, simply right-click on it, and then execute your SQL on-demand job against it and see that stuff get spun up, spun down, all in one environment. As I mentioned earlier, Spark is built directly into Synapse. It is different flavor of Spark than what exists in Azure Databricks today, and it's completely serverless. And you likewise to the SQL side, if you have a data set in here, you can right click on it, go to new notebook, and generate a new notebook where you can put in your Python or your .NET. .NET is supported in Synapse natively, and you can mix your SQL syntax directly in with that if you want to as well. It's pretty fully featured. Again, I don't spend a ton of time personally on the data science side, but I had a chance to really play around with it, and it's pretty fancy for what it does. The other nice thing about Azure Synapse Analytics is it does natively integrate with Azure DevOps, and it's planning to add more functionality there. So as you're developing these capabilities and you want to start backing that stuff up into a Git repository, you would have that capability to do that as well and sort of have that full application lifecycle. Getting started with Synapse, these workspaces are really easy. The platform is ODI compliant, so works when you log in, you create a brand new Synapse Analytics workspace. It will ask you if you would like to start with some sample scenarios, and in there is, COVID tracking, right? 311 templates, population analysis, local traffic, things like that. Things I think individuals in our customer base would really be interested in. And so you can bring in these data sets. They're all hosted directly through Microsoft. I believe most of them are all Parquet data sets, and you can begin running some sample analysis against and sort of try it out and see how it works. And because the ETL side of it is built on Data Factory, it's not quite as full featured yet as Data Factory, but it's getting there. You can actually write code-free ETL if you are comfortable with that platform, and it's a great way to get started. You don't have to, but it's an option for you. If you have data sets created in Synapse, you can then right-click on the file, essentially export it as a PBIDS file, and then that is directly importable into your Power BI desktop. And then once you connect the workspace from Power BI to Synapse, you can import that Power BI report directly in here. And that's kind of what the screenshot on the right is showing there. It's a very simple pie chart, but the example here demonstrates that in one place, you can come in and run your analysis, and you can see the reports natively. You can refresh through here as well. So it's really, really pretty slick for a one-stop shop. And on that topic, there was a private preview capability that was announced this week at Ignite. It's called the Power BI Performance Accelerator for Azure Synapse Analytics. And I personally think it's exciting, but it tracks the most utilized Power BI queries in your organization, and then it creates cache views of that. And the idea is, right, Power BI is intended to be a somewhat citizen developer service, and this is just a way for those that maybe aren't as good at optimizing queries to be able to come in here and run them. Okay, next slide, please. Since we were on Power BI, I wanted to just quickly highlight there were a lot of capabilities that were announced with regards to Power BI at Ignite. There's a link in here. We can probably put it in when we post the video to YouTube. But I just picked 3 that I thought were the most interesting. And the smart narratives is probably for me personally, one that I'm most interested in, because as a report writer in the past, I've had to write a lot of reports. You know, I hand them to folks and they come back to me and they ask me a ton of questions. Like, what are these dashboards for? What do these numbers mean? And this allows you to inject narratives directly in your reports. Really cool. The Power BI Premium User Licensing Model is just a way to reduce cost for smaller organizations. I think that's a fantastic capability. And then the visual data preparation is sort of a combination of the existing diagram view, which shows connections between your entities and your model and the modeling process itself. And that's also very, very attractive, very, very nice UI. Next slide, please. Knowledge mining with cognitive search, I'll probably actually end on this one and then turn it over. I had one more slide after this, but let me just jump into this very quickly. Why is this important? I put the number there at the bottom. 80% of data in an enterprise is unstructured. That's a Gartner quote. And that includes everything from voice recordings to videos, images, transactions. We work with a group, and you know, they had a ton of banking transactions that were going back and forth to banks, and paperwork that was associated with those transactions as attachments and that type of thing. And that's the perfect scenario for like Cosmos or data lakes, those semi-structured, unstructured repositories. And you know, the reality is once that data is in there, how do you get it out? How do you get it in your applications and make it meaningful? And Microsoft does provide this knowledge mining capability, which allows you to enrich that data so it can automatically search through content and glean location information from it, date, time information, and that sort of thing. And it's a really attractive thing. One of the other Ignite things that was mentioned, and I think it's very, very timely for where we currently are, is new cognitive service around video spatial analysis. And you can inject videos or photos into this process. So imagine you're uploading this information into a data lake store, and you can figure out how close or how far away people are in 3D space, and how long they've been where they've been and what direction they're facing. With social distancing and the COVID-19 initiatives that are out there, I think this is a very timely and attractive capability that's all built into these cognitive capabilities. And again, I could go on and on, but I want to make sure we have time to close and any questions, so I will turn it back over to Miguel.
Thank you, Mark. I appreciate it. So in closing, just really quick, obviously the massive growth in data is increasing the need for everyone to get immediate insights and demands a fast and highly scalable data platform. Establishing a modern data state is foundational in getting that transform to digital transformation complete. A modern data state enables timely insights and decision making across all your data and sets the foundation for AI, as Mark was mentioning. So what are our data state offerings here at Planet? We have broken down, as I kind of mentioned at the very beginning, our offerings into basically 2 tracks. One is the core data track, and then the analytics track as well. You're welcome to contact anyone at Microsoft at Planet, as well as emailing. You already own it, and we can go ahead and discuss that with you. There's definitely some very, very good things. Bob, I'm going to turn it back over to you, unless there's any questions.
Thanks, Miguel. So are there any questions out there in the audience while we have everyone on? Going once, going twice. Okay. Well, thanks everyone for attending this month's call. It was a great presentation from Miguel and Mark. Thanks for bringing, comprehensive set of information to us. obviously, if you guys think of any questions subsequently, feel free to email the You Already Own It at go-planet.com, or any of the folks at Planet that you're already working with today. We're happy to drill in more. With that, thanks everyone, and have a great month.